Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Pinchin's webinar this afternoon on due diligence risk assessment versus regulatory risk assessment. Which do I need? Just a couple of logistics that I'll go through first regarding the various Zoom tools that we have available at the bottom of your screen. We're going to save our questions till the end, hopefully. There is a chat area where you can put in some, the chat tool we're only going to be using if you're experiencing technical difficulties, etc. And then also there's a Q&A section where you can put in questions that you may have for the speakers towards the end of the presentation. In addition, we're going to do a couple of short polls during the presentation, which will pop up, and I would ask that you answer the questions as quickly as possible. They'll be up for about a minute, and then we will give you the results of those polls. So in order to start with introductions today, myself, I'm Vico Pulaski. I'm the Executive Vice President for the GTA region here at Pinchin, and I'd be very happy to introduce you to our speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Theresa Phillips. She's our National Risk Assessment Lead. Our next speaker is Edyta Chorostkowska, who is the Senior Risk Assessor here at Pinchin. And last but not least, we have Janet Bobechko from WeirFoulds. Janet's a partner and a certified environmental specialist and a fairly new folk at WeirFoulds. And Janet is going to be also presenting for us today. I'll pass it to Theresa. Thank you.
Thank you, Vico. Thank you everyone for joining us today and welcome. We're really excited to have you here. I think this is a topic we've wanted to talk about for a while with some of you. I do have an outline today to discuss, but I'd like to emphasize that at the end during the Q&A time, I really hope that we can turn this into more of a discussion. And I think we're all looking forward to hearing some of your viewpoints as well. So please feel free to put your questions in or make comments and provide us some feedback as well. Our topics for today, before we get into that, are start with a high-level discussion of what risk assessment is, and specifically environmental risk assessment, because that's what we're talking about today specifically. Then I'm going to speak to why you would do a risk assessment at a property for environmental purposes, any type of risk assessment, whether it's due diligence or regulatory. And then I'll pass things to Edyta, who will talk about the similarities and differences between due diligence risk assessment and ones that are submitted to the ministry in whatever jurisdiction you're in for regulatory review. So there are many, many similarities that we'd like to emphasize, as well as some differences. So we'll get into that. And then at the end, we'll hand things over to Janet, and she'll talk about some of the maybe concerns or circumstances surrounding the legal issues of certain types of risk assessment and how each type may serve your purposes. And then we'll go to a discussion. So to begin with, I want to emphasize, I'm pretty sure everyone on the line today knows what a risk assessment is, and especially those of you who work in finance. Probably you're really familiar with the term in the sense of evaluating risks for managing money and investing. So I don't really need to explain that concept to you, but I'd like to emphasize that I think a lot of people forget that risk assessment is a component of risk analysis, and it's only one of three components. And a full risk analysis is not just the risk assessment, but risk management and risk communication. So in environmental risk assessment, a risk assessment aids us in deciding how to manage risks and communicate them. Now, we as human beings do mental risk assessments all the time. Our minds, our brains are constantly doing instantaneous risk assessments, no matter what we do. So I've got a couple examples up here, one of which is crossing the street, for example. The decision to jaywalk instead of using a crosswalk is a risk assessment on your part, because you're deciding whether or not you can get across the street before any oncoming traffic comes. Participating in a sport, any sport, whether it's a contact or individual sport, really there's risk involved, and your participation is the result of a risk assessment you've done with yourself. You've decided that maybe the risk of injury is not as great as the benefits you get from participation, or you've decided that the risk of injury is so small that you're willing to take that risk, and you feel like you can manage it. One example of risk management in everyday life is in Ontario, Rowan's Law for concussion. We know there's a risk of concussion in contact sport. The risk assessment's been done. We know the risks of repeated concussion. So that's being managed in organized sport with this law, and the circulation of communications and waivers that you now have to sign is how it's being managed through educating people and communication. So every day we experience this. Now, if a risk assessment is a process for identifying hazards and their potential to cause harm, which is the definition according to the Canadian Centre of Occupational Health and Safety, an environmental risk assessment is identifying hazards in the sense of chemical contaminants on a property and their potential to cause harm to both the environment or people, the harm being health risks. In environmental risk assessment, we don't just look at plants and animals, earthworms and trees, we look at risks to human beings as well. So environmental risk assessment addresses both. The process of environmental risk assessment probably came into the light around the 1980s, I think, with the US EPA Red Book, which was the first guidance document on risk assessment. And the Canadian jurisdictions in any province of Canada basically follow the same model. So environmental risk assessment is the same throughout North America. And in fact, the process is the same all around the world. So if you go to Europe, they follow basically the same process. And in any other continent, they do. And basically, we use a universal numerical metric to quantify risk. And that allows us to look at environmental contaminants and generate some sort of a number that can be used to determine if the risks are too high or not too high. So the way we do this is for non-cancer risks is with a number we call a hazard quotient. And with cancer risks, we use an incremental lifetime cancer risk, which is a metric that determines how many extra cases of cancer you might see on a site if a contaminant was present, relative to the normal background that you would see without the contaminant. So I just want to emphasize that these numerical metrics are the same anywhere you go in the world for environmental risk assessment. But if you want to calculate risk on a property, if you want to calculate a dose and generate that numerical measure, the first thing you have to have on a site is a hazard, or in this instance, the chemical contaminant. You also have to have an exposure route, which we call a pathway, and you also have to have a receptor. If you bring all three of these together on a property and the chemical travels through a certain pathway to a receptor, then you have a potential for risk. So this is again measured through estimating what the dose is for the receptor. But if you take away any one of these three components, either the hazard, the receptor, or the pathway, then you don't have a risk, because either you have no chemical on the property, or you have no receptor. The receptors are the humans and the ecological trees and animals, or you don't have an exposure route. So the risk assessment looks at all three of these and calculates what the exposure is. We do this by generating what we call a conceptual site model. So this is a really nice pictorial demonstration of what a conceptual site model is. But basically, it's a conceptual description of a site, the hazards you might have on site, so the chemicals, where they are, so they may be in soil, they may be in groundwater, they may be in surface water. Then we look at what the exposure pathways are, and those are all those red arrows on the diagram. So the exposure routes might be volatiles that evaporate into air and are inhaled by receptors, or the exposure route might be just dermal contact, which is skin contact, so touching soil that has a chemical in it, or ingestion, so drinking groundwater that has a chemical. Those are all pathways. And then we look at what are the receptors on the property. So the receptors are human beings, birds, rabbits, trees, fish, you name it. What's really important to know is that for environmental risk assessment, especially in Ontario or in Canada, the generic standards are also risk-based. So generic standards are based on a consideration of this conceptual site model, which is generated with the assumption that pretty much every possible pathway is on the site. So in order to be protective of any property without knowing the site-specific conditions, they just basically assume the worst. Every exposure route is present and every receptor is present. And this is really important to remember further down, because I'll talk a little bit more later about the idea that the generic standards can sometimes be overly conservative because they take this approach. So on that note, I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk about why you might do a risk assessment on a site. If you're involved at all in environmental contaminant management of properties, you probably know this process already. This is also basically a universal process for environmental investigations, at least in Canada. You begin with a phase 1 investigation. If you find contaminants, if you identify activities that could introduce contaminants, you have to go do a phase 2 investigation, which means you drill, do boreholes, take water samples to see if the contaminants are present. But if you don't find anything, you go to what we've called here site closure. If there's no activities on the site, you automatically can say, okay, fine, I'm finished. If you do a phase 2 investigation and you don't find any contaminants, you can also get site closure. And in this instance, I'm referring to site closure in a really general sense, because if you're doing a risk assessment for regulatory purposes, closure would be getting that record of site condition, or in BC, that certificate of compliance. But closure to different people means different things. So I haven't called it record of site condition here. I've called it closure because closure to you might just be knowing whether or not the site is safe. It might be knowing if a building is safe to occupy. It might be getting financing, or it might be a transactional agreement. So I'm calling that closure. So going back to this flow chart, let's say we did the phase 2 investigation and you found contaminants. You may consider remediation, and if you can remediate those contaminants, then great, you can also get your closure. But for example, if remediation isn't possible for whatever reason, that's when you might consider a risk assessment. Now I have the risk assessment box here is very large and it's overlapping all the arrows, and it's that way for a reason. You can do a risk assessment after a phase 2 and risk assess all the contaminants that you find and get a closure, or you can do a risk assessment to derive different standards for the property and then remediate to those new standards, or you can do a combination of both, risk assess some, remediate some. Either way, risk assessment overlaps with each of these processes and can lead to site closure. But it's really, really helpful at that stage to consider all your options and discuss this with your contaminant site management experts to figure out which approach is best for you, because not every site is the same, and by the time we get to risk assessment, every situation can be very different. Another reason you might do a risk assessment, a reason you might do risk assessment instead of remediation would be because remediation may not necessarily be financially feasible, or it may not be technically feasible. So in some cases you have contaminants that are really, really deep, or just hard to get at. They might be under a building and you don't plan to demolish the building, so they're not accessible, or it's too costly to access them. You might find in some cases that it just takes too long. Maybe remediation is possible, but it might take years and years to do. So risk assessment can help with the timing and get you through the process to closure faster. And another example would be if you're doing excavation and disposal of soil, because the costs to, say, dig and dump get much, much higher the bigger the property, but risk assessment prices don't really change with the size of the property. So at some point, it might be more economically feasible to risk assess. Another reason you might risk assess is if there's already management in place. So if your property is like the one on the left-hand side, we have a hazard, we've got a polar bear, and a definite exposure route to our poor receptor on the other side, our human being, and even a worse scenario if the only sort of management, that vehicle, drives off. Now we have a definite exposure route, and this hazard is going to get at our receptor. But on the right-hand side, there is a barrier in place between the hazard, the polar bear, and the child, who's our receptor, and that barrier is going to stay there for quite a long time. It's a permanent fixture. It's, I'm going to assume it's in a zoo and that they don't plan to tear down the zoo anytime soon. So in that instance, there's no need to remove the hazard. The receptor's safe, the barrier is appropriate, and risk assessment is an adequate way to protect that child. And a third reason why you might do a risk assessment would be if some pathways or receptors just aren't present on the property. So now I'm coming back to that conceptual site model that I showed you before, that the generic standards are based on. But as I said before, they consider that every single receptor and every pathway is present. One good example, or just a really simple example of this, would be copper in groundwater. So copper is extremely toxic to fish, toxic to their gills, but not overly toxic to people, and has a moderate toxicity to other plants and trees. If you have design a conceptual site model for this property, you might evaluate all the exposure pathways and receptors, and you would find you might have people in a building, but copper's not very volatile, so inhalation isn't really going to drive the standard. You've got humans having skin contact with soil. You've got animals, plants, and birds and bunnies that are hopping around outside, maybe eating some of the vegetation outside. Copper's not overly toxic to them. And then root uptake of maybe that contaminated groundwater by trees. Copper's a little bit toxic to them, but like I said, it's more toxic to fish than anything. And if your property happens to be very far away from any surface water bodies, we could eliminate that pathway and use the next highest protected value to protect the rest of the receptors on the site. In doing so, the risk assessment might actually be able to provide for you a standard for the property that's equally protective for all the receptors that are there without having to do any remediation at all. So that's very helpful. Now on that note, I'm going to hand things to Edyta, who will carry on with talking about due diligence risk assessments and when you would do that instead of a regulatory risk assessment.
Perfect. Thank you, Theresa. So before we actually get going, I'm hoping to pull up a poll question. So Rui, if you're able to pull up, perfect. So if you can all answer, have you worked with a site where risk assessment was used? So just simple yes or no. And if so, which type of risk assessment was it? Was it a regulatory one submitting to a regulatory body, or simply a due diligence one, or both? So if you wouldn't mind letting us know, it'd be nice to see what everyone's experience is. So we'll give that a few more seconds. All right, do we have answers yet? All right, wow, all of you have had to deal with risk assessments. That's actually great. Looks like actually the majority of you have actually had both regulatory and due diligence experience, which is even better. And I'm so glad to hear that, because it means that we have a lot of exposure here. So that's good to hear. All right, so when to actually consider a due diligence risk assessment instead of a regulatory one. Obviously, there are a variety of reasons. We all know the tried and true tested one is because it's just peace of mind. You have to go through the motions. It's for internal due diligence. There's a transactional agreement. You're either selling or buying a property, and it's simply a requirement as part of that process. There are obviously some financial obligations. Your bank may require this as assurance to make sure that there are no issues down the road. Perhaps there's an insurance reason. Maybe there was a spill somewhere that couldn't be fully remediated. So we're going to use the risk assessment option. Obviously, there are some legal proceedings. It could be requested by a municipality for permitting. And I bring up property value. This is an interesting one, because in the GT, the Greater Toronto area, for example, and maybe even the Greater Vancouver area, property values are so high that completing a risk assessment, even if it's, let's say, over $100,000, it's really a drop in the bucket when you think about the value of your property. But if you go a little outside of these areas where property values are much lower, completing a very expensive, regulatory risk assessment that's perhaps over $100,000 is really a big chunk potentially of the value of that property. So it makes it really, question whether it is feasible to complete any work, because what if remediation work is not feasible, and then now risk assessment work is too expensive. So this is when hopefully something like a due diligence risk assessment could be used. And ultimately, as long as there is no regulatory requirement, in Ontario, this tends to be if there's no change in land use to a more sensitive use, then you can use a due diligence risk assessment. Obviously, if there is a change in land use to a more sensitive use, then you just have to go through the regulatory process. So I really wanted to focus here on what is similar with a due diligence and a regulatory RA, because a lot of you might think, well, RAs there's a lot of components to them. I'm not sure what's correct and what's not. If we just follow the regulatory RA, then I know if it's good enough for the ministry, then it'll be good enough for me. And that's absolutely a good, way to proceed. But we're here to tell you that the due diligence risk assessments that we complete, and most consultants complete, in Canada and throughout the world, have to follow standard industry practices and their guidelines. Usually that's your local guidelines. So again, in Ontario, we do have to follow all of the Reg 153 guidelines, okay? So we have the same risk thresholds. Theresa mentioned this earlier when she talked about for human health, there is a non-carcinogenic hazard quotient threshold, or an incremental cancer risk threshold. In Ontario, that cancer risk threshold is 1 in 1 million. And in other jurisdictions, it's different. But again, when we do due diligence work, we do have to follow that more sensitive risk threshold, because we are in that jurisdiction. Obviously, when you go down into a DDRA, you may be able to deviate a little bit, but for the most part, we really do follow these risk thresholds. We also have standardized, obviously, receptor characteristics. That means that we have to follow the ministry's minimum exposure routes, exposure uptakes. We know that an adult is supposed to, not supposed to, but it does weigh, that person weighs a certain amount. They take up soil a certain amount. They're potentially present at a property for a certain length of time. And we use these values because the ministry used them to create generic standards. So if we're going to whittle down and determine which pathways have risks, we have to use those same guidelines and those same exposure pathways and those same receptor inputs. So we really do have conservative assumptions. And here, for example, we have the ministry assumes that a person is working at a property, at the same property for 56 years. Well, we all know that's extremely long and unrealistic, but it's something that we have to follow, and only further into the DDRA is there a potential for us to deviate from this conservative assumption. And just finally, a DDRA can be completed in the spirit of a regulatory risk assessment. It's a little bit more onerous because we would have to follow the ministries or whatever the regulatory body is, their formatting requirements, but ultimately it can also be done. And another important concept is that our DDRA work does have a lot of people in the background. You know, we do have to confer with our hydrogeologists, our ecologists, even though they may not sign the report, but we do call them and we ask for their input on various different components. So you do know that there's a huge team behind this effort and a lot of information. But also we have our folks from finance and law, you know, very important. You know, these are the people that drive the actual need for this work. You know, if a property perhaps has offsite migration, you know, that is a huge implication also, not only for how much a bank is willing to provide financing, but what the legal implications are. And hopefully Janet will get into that a little bit later. And another important reason why we are marketing this due diligence side of risk assessment work is because it tends to be more pragmatic when we talk about how we communicate the risk and how we communicate how those risks need to be managed. So if you're completing a regulatory RA, the ministry requires you to have very stringent risk management measures. For example, if you're, you know, if you have a direct contact risk, the ministry will make you cap the entire site, property boundary to boundary, with either a hard cap, so asphalt, concrete, a building, or a fill cap. And that means a meter of clean material throughout your entire property, which is very expensive, depending on the size of your property, and probably overly conservative, because what if your impacts are only at one corner of the property and they have been well delineated and they're only in this little corner? So why would I have to cap the entire site? You know, under a regulatory RA, it's just a requirement. There's no instrument for the ministry to move things around and only require a portion of the property to be managed. Whereas in a DDRA, we can make that distinction, and we can whittle down exactly what needs to be managed. And finally, how we communicate that. You know, like in the regulatory RAs, it's a very technical document. Some of the wording is, you know, a little overwhelming, and it's just the jargon is there because it's required by the ministry. But we try to communicate to a wide range of individuals in DDRAs and try to make sure that everybody understands risks, even if you have to present this perhaps to a tenant or any other stakeholders. So ideally, risk assessment aids in your decision-making process and actually helps weigh your options. And finally, for myself, the meat, I'm sure you're all wondering, what is really the difference and why would I choose DDRA versus regulatory RA? Well, very obviously the costs and timelines. It's much cheaper to do a DDRA. It's more cost effective because simply the assessment is quicker. A lot of that has to do with the volume of the report. You know, we're not going through that onerous regulatory method, and there isn't a lot of back and forth with any sort of peer reviewer. Although it is possible to get a DDRA peer reviewed, it's not required. And under the mandated regulatory review, there are multiple submissions that have to be done. And there's a lot of interpretation of the information. People, you know, read the regulations slightly differently, and oftentimes a regulator tends to be more conservative. So we try to push them a little bit to make sure that you know, this site is not the most overly conservative site. So that's where a lot of the timelines come into place and a lot of the costs, because we do have to follow these you know, more stringent requirements. The scope is also different. However, keep in mind that it can be a full regulatory RA under a due diligence umbrella. So that is an option there. And I say limited because there is an option for a due diligence risk assessment. And that really is a term for many types of due diligence risk assessment. It could be a screening level risk assessment where you're only really dealing with what's on site right now at this instance of time. I'm not thinking about any sort of future construction scenarios. I'm not looking outside the box. It's simply a very generic scenario. Or it can be, maybe it's just human health. Maybe the entire property is capped and all we're really worried about is indoor air inhalation for humans that are in that building. So it can be limited, and that's where we really rely on our stakeholders to let us know, what is really driving this assessment and site closure. And finally, a lot of flexibility. Like we mentioned, we can do various different assessments. We, under a ministry's approach, although we have to follow those conservative assumptions, like assuming that somebody's going to be at a property for 56 years, but then we can go site specific. And then let's say we have a retirement residence where maybe the average person is only going to be living at a property for maybe the next 15 or 20 years. So we can reduce and complete more of a site specific assessment to figure out what are the actual standards that would be applicable to the site. So that's where we mean by it could be a flexible assessment, whereas the regulatory RA, obviously very stringent, has to meet the generic guidelines. And just to end off for myself, a due diligence risk assessment, at the end of the day, you're going to get due diligence closure. So what that means is you're going to have a document that goes through the entire environmental summary up to that date and time. It will assess all of the risks that are applicable, or if there are no risks, that will also be the results, and any risk management measures. Under the regulatory RA, this is a similar process where, although that record of site condition is really nice to have, all it really says is the summary of all the environmental work that happened up to that date, what the risks are, and how to manage them. So something very important to keep in mind is that the result, although it's in a different package, really does say similar things. So with that, I'd like to hand it off to Janet, who will hopefully talk about some more interesting concepts with the due diligence versus regulatory work.
Great, thank you, Theresa and Edyta, for going sort of through the basics. For part of the legal discussion, the one thing that I want to really draw out is understanding the goal of it. You've heard from Theresa and Edyta in relation to what the different types of risk assessments are, whether it's a regulatory risk assessment or a due diligence risk assessment. But from a legal perspective, it really is important to understand, why are you even having a discussion about a risk assessment? Are there legal requirements that you have to achieve? Are there financing requirements? We'll go through that a little bit in the various topics I've listed on the slide. But what I find is always, I think, sometimes frustrating for legal counsel is that we get brought in at the end of the process when either a decision may have been made, as opposed to at the beginning. And whenever we talk about environmental issues and potential remediation, or what the goal is and what the necessity is to obtain a record of site condition or a risk assessment or deal with environmental contamination, it should involve the entire team. Edyta showed you, Theresa showed you sort of an image of all the different players on it. And I can't emphasize enough that that team approach is very important to making sure that you are achieving your goals, mitigating your risk, using your money wisely to obtain the right outcome, and to make sure that that outcome is going to actually achieve your goals. And sometimes that if the team is involved early enough in the process, then you become much more efficient in relation to understanding what a scope might be in relation to a risk assessment. So having that comprehensive discussion up front and early is important. So for regulatory requirements for a risk assessment, we know if the goal is ultimately in Ontario to get a record of site condition and you've changed, you're used to something more sensitive, remediation, including a risk assessment, might be an option for it. Other reasons why there might be an administrative order to remediate the site, and risk assessment is an option that you can use in relation to achieving closure on that order. Sometimes you also have other obligations. The law in Ontario and most provinces across the country are that you can't cause any kind of an adverse effect. And so risk assessments are really useful to show that there are no adverse effects. And whether that has to be a regulatory risk assessment or a due diligence risk assessment is open to interpretation. One other sort of reminder in relation to the difference between regulatory risk assessments and due diligence risk assessments is that if you achieve a record of site condition in Ontario and again in whatever that document is in most provinces, you are allowed some regulatory closure in relation to what is disclosed in that risk assessment. So as opposed to civil liability, there is some regulatory benefit to doing a regulatory risk assessment. The other thing, reason why you have to potentially look at the type of risk assessment you are doing is that is there a contractual requirement between two parties in relation to a purchase or sale of a property? Is there a requirement in a financing to try to say that the bank or the lender prior to advancing funds wants to understand what the risk is, and can that risk be achieved and understood best by a due diligence risk assessment, or do you need to go to a full risk assessment? Early on, when risk assessments became sort of known, and we had in Ontario, the introduction of our Regulation 15304, we saw a lot of terms and financings that said in the term sheet that you have to get a record of site condition or you have to do risk assessment without a full-blown understanding of the cost of the implications and the timing for those terms. So again, that's why when we try to have discussions, they should be early and often in relation to what the goal is and what do you actually need to achieve risk disclosure, risk mitigation, and how can you quantify what that risk is. You may also want to do it for literally due diligence purposes, whether it be peace of mind to show employees that there is no risk, even though there might be contamination on the property. Maybe you're doing it in advance to assess the risk for a potential future transaction. You're preparing part of your portfolio to understand what your risks and liabilities are. And so a due diligence risk assessment might be the way, whether it's a screening, and I think Edyta made a really important point that I don't want to be lost. For a due diligence risk assessment, you can scope what you actually want to assess. It is all the chemicals, the contaminants of concern. Is it more limited? Is it in relation to a specific portion of the property? Is it the whole property? And again, helping with that scope goes back to understanding what the goals of the risk assessment, the due diligence risk assessment is. And we've certainly used it in relation to doing it, scoping it for that exact reason, for disclosure to employees in a health and safety situation, or again, only on a portion of land where it wasn't relevant for it to be for the entire purpose for the land. The other thing I think that's important from a legal perspective is the public versus the private nature of risk assessments. In Ontario, when you are doing a regulatory risk assessment, it is a public process. Because at the end of the day, if you are trying to achieve a record of site condition, you end up with a certificate of property use that is posted on the environmental registry. It's there forever. There is a very public record of it. And it can be searched, it can be used in various ways. Again, it can be used for protection, but it also can be used by third parties in relation to adjacent neighbors if that is a concern. A due diligence risk assessment, however, is private. There is no requirement to disclose it from a regulatory perspective. You can still manage those same risks and you can measure it, but it is just between the parties who choose to use it and to disclose it. One of the key points, though, is reliance on that due diligence risk assessment, and frankly, on any risk assessment. Edyta had mentioned that, there's a reliance on it for 18 months. So that 18-month window, is a potential concern in relation to things are changing. We have different chemicals of concern that are coming up. We know that PFAS and PFOS is on the radar to being regulated. So that is something to be mindful of. So some of the additional implications that you have in relation to a risk assessment is that, again, in Ontario, we have a certificate of property use that's registered on title to the property. So it gives notice to the world, both by registration in the environmental registry, but also on title to the land. You may be required to undertake monitoring and to report to the ministry by filing annual reports. You may have, there are always obligations in every certificate of property use to provide a copy of the risk assessment to every occupier of the property. So if you're doing risk assessment on a property that has a lot of tenants in it, that means that every single tenant must be provided with a copy or the opportunity to review a copy of the risk assessment. There is, however, long-term stability in relation to the risk assessment, in relation to the concentrations that are there, because risk assessments, like records of site condition, don't change. They lock those requirements in at a specific period of time, but you can't be required to go back unless there are certain statutory reopeners to go back and change those numbers. The other thing that is arguable, there's no case law on it yet, but certainly once you have a risk assessment, regulatory risk assessment, because it is a public process and it is registered on title and it's registered on a public registry, there is an argument that could be used that it is the start of the running of any limitation periods in relation to what's disclosed in the risk assessments. For a due diligence risk assessment, it doesn't lead to record of site condition, so there's no sort of statutory closure for that part, but it is, again, very useful for the other reasons that we talked about in relation to financing. You can, I guess the private nature of a due diligence risk assessment does have to deal with disclosure and also confidentiality requirements. So with any due diligence risk assessment, you are going to want to make sure that any documents contain a confidentiality provision, not just the reliance in relation to privity of contract and who can rely on it, but specific requirements as to under which circumstances it can be disclosed and who it can be disclosed to. If we can go to the next slide, please. So some of the additional legal considerations are risk mitigation. Is the risk assessment being done to mitigate and allocate the risks? Does it require disclosure? And we talked a little bit about that in relation to confidentiality. Who can you disclose it to? Is it for negotiating the terms of an indemnity? And does it form the basis of that if there's something that changes in relation to these numbers that are in a due diligence risk assessment or in a regulatory risk assessment, that it again can be used as part of a baseline assessment for a property? If it is for financing, are there requirements for due diligence risk assessment that after 18 months, because financing is usually longer for that, to go and update it? So these are things that you need to understand and to work out in any contractual agreements that is going to allow you either to do a regulatory risk assessment or a due diligence risk assessment. From a timing perspective and closing the deal, they sort of go very much together. Edyta and Theresa talked about the length of time it can take to undertake a regulatory risk assessment. From that perspective, a lot of times what we've done in deals where they don't last 2 years for it, so you have to figure out a way to close your deal and to move forward. So oftentimes what we'll do is we'll use a due diligence risk assessment to start to close the deal with obligations then, if required, to obtain a regulatory risk assessment. So you can build on one for the other, and at least it allows you to bring a commercial close to your deal and to provide you with some comfort, all the parties with some kind of comfort going forward. Project phasing is another way that due diligence, especially in my experience, risk assessments can be used, because to do a risk assessment for an entire site, it doesn't necessarily help you in relation to understanding the overall project development. So oftentimes what we'll do is we'll use a due diligence risk assessment on part of the property or on the overall property to help us understand phasing, what portions might be at greater risk of having to do full remediation, or different types of remediation, might be longer term remediation, or maybe it's inaccessible, as Theresa had mentioned. But a due diligence risk assessment can help you understand the overall ability to do something with a site. And it opens the conversation up in relation to options, and again, using your financing wisely. Last thing I want to talk about are ongoing obligations, and these can be somewhat of a challenge. As Edyta said, in regulatory risk assessments, you have significant risk management measures, and they are very clearly set out in relation to the legal obligations. They go with the owner of the property, and they're registered on title to the land. When you have a due diligence risk assessment, there are recommendations for risk management measures. You're going to have potentially some type of contractual arrangement to underpin that those risk management measures are actually undertaken, because without them, they're not protective and they don't fulfill the requirement of closing off the various pathways, as Theresa had mentioned. So from my perspective, you want to make sure that you understand what those ongoing obligations are, and that you have the ability to have a contractually enforcement, a contract to enforce what those are, especially for a due diligence risk assessment. There may be things like financial assurances that are required in a regulatory risk assessment. You don't have that in a due diligence risk assessment, but maybe it's wise to put money into escrow as part of a deal, or to provide some additional account that can be populated with money should there be an environmental concern later on down the way. So at the end of the day, there are lots of different reasons why you may choose a due diligence risk assessment or a regulatory risk assessment. And it's a careful evaluation of all of the different factors that need to be taken into consideration. We certainly see the rise of due diligence risk assessments as a very practical tool to get a feel for it and to move deals forward in a financially economical way when you don't, again, need that regulatory risk assessment from the very beginning. So that's it from the legal side.
Thank you, Janet. Sorry, I'm trying to come back. So if anyone, thank you, Janet, thank you, Edyta. And if anyone has some questions, we would be more than happy to answer them at this time. And I'll leave this slide up for a little while so that you can copy our contact information as well if you have any private questions you'd like to bring to either of the three of us.
I do have one question. Janet mentioned at the end of her presentation, there are ongoing obligations, and it's interesting for us because as the people that do the risk assessment, it often ends at the risk management stage. So Janet, what happens after risk management measures are recommended in a due diligence risk assessment? And what happens afterwards? Because there's no certificate of property use, there's no ministry coming and checking. So how does that get done to make sure that it is done?
Well, and again, it depends on the reason, and if it's between parties and in a transaction to buy or sell the property, or whether it's for financing. But in my view, if you just have a due diligence risk assessment that doesn't have any obligation to do, then you haven't fulfilled I guess the goal of the due diligence risk assessment. So you have to have some ongoing way to track and monitor and implement those. So whether it's for, again, having a hard cap or a fill cap, having active or passive venting of a building that goes into a design spec. So there has to be, at least in my mind, some kind of contractual obligation to move forward. So in financing, we'd say that you have to implement the risk management measures that are set out in the due diligence risk assessment. That would be a condition of the financing. If it's in relation to an agreement of purchase and sale, then the parties need to determine who is going to be responsible and pay for that. So again, it's a negotiation between the parties, but there does need to be some follow-up that can be enforced through a contract.
I do see one question that popped up, so I'll go ahead and ask that. How is a due diligence risk assessment as good if there is less site sampling? Theresa, did you want to maybe answer that one?
Sure, I can speak to that. I apologize, my video is not working. You may see for the due diligence risk assessments, the site characterization isn't as detailed and extreme as a regulatory one, and that's largely a contributing factor to why a DDRA is less expensive. But when we do environmental assessments, the majority of the sampling is done on a worst case basis. So if a potential activity at a site is identified that will contribute to contamination, the first place we would drill a borehole is exactly where that activity took place. And the assumption is that the maximum concentration you would find on the property is going to be closest to the source. So any stepping out and additional delineation, it can be helpful, especially if we think there might be off-site migration of something like groundwater, but oftentimes has absolutely no bearing on the conclusion of the risk assessment, because the risk assessment is based on that highest maximum concentration you find. So that initial borehole usually will drive that. And another example of where that might come into play would be for things like metal impacts under a building. If we already know perhaps that a site has contamination and metal impacts in fill material, but the site is capped, so those pathways are blocked, it's not all that valuable to know whether or not we've found the ultimate maximum concentration of those metals. They're not volatile, so we don't have concerns about that. Maybe in soils, we're not worried about offsite migration. They're capped. So having delineation or having a whole pile of boreholes so that we're absolutely sure we found that statistical maximum doesn't have any bearing on the conclusion of the RA. It's just an exercise to gather more data and spend more money, really.
And we have another question here. Because there are no real standards for each consultant to complete a DDRA like there are regulatory RA, how can we as property owners navigate whether it is acceptable and what would prevent another consultant from poking holes in it and having an ongoing battle?
Well, that's a really good question. I mean, that's why we begin by sticking to what the ministry recommends as all of the model inputs. So we use the same toxicity reference values and the same inputs to the exposure models because it's already been vetted with the ministry. If we do that, we will certify, we'll sign off at the bottom that says, yep, we did this in this, and that's in the spirit of the regulation, really. We follow all that guidance. If we deviate from that, we will let you know. And usually what would happen we would do a site-specific risk assessment using all those same assumptions that the ministry mandates. No matter what province we're working in, we'll do it according to that ministry. And if there are risks that are predicted at that stage, we may come to our client and say, look, you know, we could modify the model this way and explain that. There's always an opportunity to get a peer reviewer to come in. And if the peer reviewer has, quite often they have similar experience to ours, similar accreditations, then they may say, yeah, that makes perfect sense. But if you're not comfortable with that, we do it exactly like the regulation would, like the guidance documents say.
And I just want to pick up on that, Theresa, because I think you mentioned the really important thing, and a peer reviewer. So in circumstances, because there is, and the question is quite accurate, that there is no standard form for it, and the best you can do is follow and disclose up front. So we've used peer reviewers as a way to sort of fact check that it is acceptable. And in certain instances, we require that they be on the ministry's list for reviewers in that instance. So again, that they have you have the credibility of their credentials for your peer reviewer. So I think that is a helpful component to it. And, you know, there can be shoddy risk assessments, no doubt about it. But the reality is when you use quality people with the right qualifications and the reputation that you're going to get a quality product that will give confidence to the parties in the transaction. And oftentimes as well in a transaction, we set the scope of work, and the scope of work is to be decided between the parties in advance.
Mhm.
So that is again an important part of the negotiation, is that what is the scope? And if the parties agree on it, again, it protects everybody in that process to giving transparency.
For sure. And I'll also add that a peer reviewer, that process, and that even if it becomes a back and forth and there's a little bit of debate about it, because risk assessments are very subjective. So there's going to be some opinion and some judgment. That goes without saying, but it sure is a heck of a lot faster still than the regulatory process, which really is just back and forth with a peer reviewer, but you have to wait 3 months to get an answer instead of calling them up and discussing it tomorrow.
Okay, we have another question here from Alan. What percentage of DDRAs move to the next stage, RA? I understand that every job is different. And is it easier to sell to clients? So I'm assuming, is it easy to sell DDRAs to clients? I could answer that a little bit. It is becoming more and more easier to sell to clients, the due diligence risk assessment, because again, we are, like we mentioned, we are following the regulatory processes, we're following those guidelines, we're using the same assumptions and pathways that they're really, more and more people are really understanding that there is just as much value in a due diligence RA than there is in a regulatory RA, and they're quicker. And you know what, the ministry doesn't actually like when a project is going towards a record of site condition that is not having a change in land use. So it's, it's bogging down the system as well. So this, more and more people are becoming aware that DDRAs are really some of the way to go. If anyone else. Any other questions?
That's it. And we're at 3 minutes to 3, so maybe we should say goodbye. But thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Really appreciate seeing you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, for participating.
Thanks also.